December 5, 1941, 3 o'clock hours, the Klinsalnik-Nogorsk sector, north of Moscow. The world is a monochromatic void of white and gray. A wind from the Arctic, the Boran, screams through the skeletal remains of birch forests, pushing the temperature down to a bone-cracking -35°C. Inside their shallow, frozen foxholes, German grenadiers of the 35th Infantry Division are no longer soldiers. They are statues of ice, wrapped in stolen civilian shawls and stiffened newspapers. Their oil has turned to jelly in their rifles. Their tank engines are dead lumps of iron. They are 18 miles from the Kremlin. They are waiting for the Soviet Union to finally, mercifully, break. Then the silence of the frost is obliterated. A low, rhythmic growl rises from the eastern horizon, the Stalin organs. Thousands of 132mm rockets tear through the purple dawn, painting the snow in fire. Through the waist-deep drifts, shadows begin to move. They are not the ragged militias the Germans expected. These are men in thick sheepskin coats, white felt boots, and automatic weapons that still fire. They do not stumble. They glide on skis. As the first wave of Siberian riflemen screams their Ura into the freezing air, the German officers realize a terrifying truth: the Red Army isn't dead, it has been waiting. Once, long ago, there was a land where the winter was not a season, but a sentinel. In the winter of 1941, that sentinel stood guard over a city that the world had already written off as lost. The story of the Moscow counteroffensive is the story of a ghost army that rose from the ice when the machines of the modern world had failed. It is the story of how the subhuman enemy the Wehrmacht expected to shatter instead turned the tide of history by advancing when they were expected to disappear. By the late autumn of 1941, the German military machine appeared unstoppable. Since the launch of Operation Barbarossa in June, the Wehrmacht had carved through the Soviet Union with surgical precision, trapping millions of Red Army soldiers in massive pockets at Minsk, Kiev, and Vyazma. To the observers in London and Washington, the fall of the Soviet Union was not a question of if, but when. In late September, Adolf Hitler ordered the final blow, Operation Typhoon. The objective was the total capture of Moscow, the political and logistical heart of the USSR. Hitler believed that if the head of the Slavic beast was severed, the entire nation would collapse. Initially, the offensive lived up to its name. The German Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, fielded nearly 2 million men, over 1,000 tanks, and the full weight of the Luftwaffe. By early October, they had shattered the Soviet Western and Reserve fronts, capturing over 600,000 men in the Vyazma-Bryansk pocket. The road to Moscow was virtually open. Panic gripped the Soviet capital. Foreign embassies were evacuated. And on October 16th, a mass exodus of civilians began as rumors spread that German motorcycle units had reached the city's outskirts. Stalin remained in the Kremlin, but the situation was so dire that he declared a state of siege. The defense was handed to General Georgy Zhukov, a man known for a temperament as cold and hard as the steel of the tanks he commanded. However, the German Typhoon soon encountered a force that no amount of Prussian drill could overcome: the Russian climate. First came the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. October rains turned the unpaved Russian roads into swamps of black, viscous sludge. German supply trucks sank to their axles. Horse-drawn wagons, the backbone of the Wehrmacht's logistics, were swallowed whole. The lightning war, the blitzkrieg, slowed to a crawl. The German High Command, however, viewed this as a temporary setback. They believed that once the ground froze, their panzers would regain their mobility and roll into Red Square. They did not realize that the frost they were praying for would become their greatest executioner, and that the exhausted Red Army was using every minute of the delay to build a wall of fire around their capital. In mid-November, the mud finally hardened. The temperature plummeted, and the German engines roared back to life for the final lunge. This was the starvation offensive. The German soldiers were now fighting without winter uniforms, as the logistics chain had prioritized fuel and ammunition over coats and boots. Despite the frostbite, the 2nd Panzer Division pushed to within 18 miles of the city center. close enough for officers to see the golden domes of the Kremlin through their artillery binoculars. They were at the absolute limit of their endurance. But the German High Command was convinced that one last push would break the Soviet will. They believed the Red Army had committed its last reserves of workers and boys to the trenches. Unbeknownst to the Germans, a massive geopolitical shift had occurred in the shadows. In Tokyo, the Soviet master spy Richard Sorge had delivered the most critical intelligence report of the war. Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in the East, choosing instead to focus on the Pacific and Southeast Asia. This single piece of information allowed Stalin to make a move that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. He authorized the transport of the Siberian Division's elite, fresh and fully equipped cold-weather troops across the Trans-Siberian Railway. While the world watched the German advance, 250,000 veteran soldiers, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft were moving silently toward Moscow. These were the Siberians. They were men who considered minus 20 degrees Celsius a mild day. They arrived in Moscow not as a disorganized mob, but as a cohesive force of ghost-white figures. As they detrained, they were moved immediately into the deep forest surrounding the capital, hidden from German aerial reconnaissance by the thick canopy and the winter mist. Zhukov, with characteristic ruthlessness, refused to commit these reserves to plug small holes in the line. He allowed the German units to exhaust themselves against the desperate People's militia in the suburbs, waiting for the exact moment when the German spearhead was overextended and frozen. By the first days of December, the Wehrmacht had reached its culminating point. The machine had stopped. The men were dying in their sleep from the cold. The stage was set for the advance that no one, not Hitler, not the Allied High Command, and certainly not the shivering German infantry saw coming. The success of the Moscow counteroffensive can be analyzed through the technological angle of specialized winter warfare and the tactical angle of Zhukov's deep battle principles. From a technological standpoint, the disparity between the two armies in December 1941 was not just about numbers, but about thermal endurance. The German Panzer III and IV, while formidable in the European summer, became liabilities in the Russian winter. Their narrow tracks sank into the snow, and their high-compression engines required fires to be lit underneath the chassis just to thaw the frozen lubricants. In contrast, the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks were designed with the steppe in mind. Their wide tracks provided lower ground pressure, allowing them to float over snowdrifts that immobilized German armor. Furthermore, the Soviet use of compressed air starters meant their engines could roar to life instantly in sub-zero temperatures, providing a mobility advantage that the Germans simply could not match. From the tactical angle, General Georgy Zhukov demonstrated a mastery of timing. While the world expected him to throw every available man into a static defense of the city streets, Zhukov practiced what he called active defense. He deliberately traded space for time, allowing the German Typhoon to stretch its supply lines to the breaking point. He waited until the German formations were bent around Moscow in a dangerous horseshoe shape, with their flanks exposed and their center exhausted. Tactically, he did not plan a frontal assault. He planned a series of concentric strikes aimed at the hinges of the German pincer. By using the Siberian divisions as a mobile fist, he intended to not just push the Germans back, but to encircle and destroy the very units that had spent the last 5 months winning every battle. This shift from desperate defense to sophisticated offensive maneuver marked the evolution of the Red Army, from a shattered force into a modern military machine. The human and logistical dimensions of the counteroffensive provide the final pieces of the puzzle. The human angle of the Siberian soldier and the logistical angle of the internal line for the German infantrymen. The Soviet soldier had been described by propaganda as a subhuman mass capable only of frontal rushes. In December 1941, that perception was shattered by the Siberian riflemen. These were men who possessed an almost supernatural comfort in the frost. Unlike the European-raised Germans, the Siberians knew how to prevent gangrene, how to sleep in the snow without freezing to death, and how to maintain their weapons with dry graphite instead of oil that froze solid. They carried the PPS H-41 submachine gun, weapon with a high rate of fire and a drum magazine that rarely jammed in the cold. To the Germans, these white-clad figures emerging from the mist were ghosts, silent, lethal, and seemingly immune to the elements. Complementing this human resilience was the logistical angle. By December, the German supply lines stretched over 1,000 miles across hostile territory, plagued by partisans and the lack of a compatible rail gauge. Every gallon of fuel had to travel days to reach the front. Conversely, the Soviet defenders were fighting on internal lines. Moscow was the hub of the entire Soviet rail network. This meant Zhukov could move entire divisions from one side of the city to the other in a matter of hours. The Soviets were operating within a localized industrial bubble, with the factories of Moscow still producing T-34s and Katyusha rockets that could be driven straight from the assembly line to the front. The world expected the Soviet Union to break because they were looking at the map of lost territory. They failed to see that the territory the Soviets still held was the most densely connected and defensible part of the entire empire. This logistical superiority turned the outskirts of Moscow into a spring-loaded trap, ready to snap shut on an army that was literally freezing in place. The intersection of these angles created a unique moment in history. The German army was a high-tech machine stripped of its power by the environment, while the Soviet army was a resilient organism perfectly adapted to that same environment. As the thermometers hit their lowest point on December 5th, the Siberian Ghost was no longer a myth, it was a looming catastrophe for the Third Reich. The morning of December 5, 1941, did not bring the final German victory march into Red Square. Instead, it brought the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt the Wehrmacht for the rest of the war. At 3 o'clock, the temperature settled at a murderous minus 38 degrees Celsius. The German Fourth Army and the Second Panzer Army were effectively paralyzed. Their grease had hardened into stone, and their soldiers were so weakened by dysentery and frostbite that they could barely lift their rifles. Across a 500-mile front stretching from Kalinin in the north to Yelets in the south, the Soviet counteroffensive, the winter counterattack, was unleashed. The weight of the blow fell first on the northern flank of the German pincer. General Ivan Konev's Kalinin front struck with a ferocity that defied all German intelligence reports. They bypassed German strongpoints on skis, cutting the only heated supply routes available to the invaders. German commanders, who had spent months reporting that the Red Army was at its last gasp, watched in horror as fresh, well-clothed Soviet battalions poured out of the woods. The Siberian Ghost Army had materialized, were forced into brutal hand-to-hand combat against men who were energized by the frost. The shock was not just tactical, it was psychological. The German Army Group Center was not prepared for a defensive war. They had no secondary trench lines, no heated bunkers in the rear, and no plans for a retreat. By midday, the 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups, the elite spearheads of the drive on Moscow, were being forced into a disorganized withdrawal. For the first time since the invasion of Poland in 1939, the German Wehrmacht was not dictating the terms of the engagement. They were being hunted through the snow by a force the world believed had already been destroyed. By December 6th, the localized breakthrough had expanded into a general collapse of the German front. General Zhukov unleashed the Western Front. A vital junction for the German northern pincer became a graveyard of burnt-out trucks and frozen horses. The German retreat quickly threatened to turn into a rout. Officers reported soldiers abandoning their heavy equipment, artillery pieces that were frozen to the ground, and tanks that had run out of fuel simply to move faster toward the west. The invincible Wehrmacht was fleeing, leaving behind a trail of abandoned material that stretched for miles along the snowy roads. The most dramatic moment occurred on the southern flank near Tula. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg and commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, realized his forces were being enveloped by the Soviet 10th and 50th Armies, were being hunted by T-34s that appeared from the whiteout conditions of the blizzards, fired their 76mm guns, and vanished back into the mist. The psychological impact on the German leadership was profound. Field Marshal von Bock, suffering from a stomach ailment and the stress of the collapse, noted in his diary that the will of the troops to attack is exhausted. The turning point was solidified when the Soviet forces captured Kalinin and Yelets, effectively unzipping the German lines of communication. The world, which had been waiting for the news of Moscow's fall, instead received reports of a German army in full-scale withdrawal. The myth of the Lightning War died in the drifts of the Moscow suburbs. The Red Army had not only held the line. It had proven that the German machine could be broken by an enemy that possessed a greater capacity for suffering and the scale of the German defeat at the gates of Moscow was a shock to the global military establishment. By the time the Soviet counteroffensive slowed in early 1942, the Wehrmacht had been pushed back between 100 and 250 kilometers from the capital. The cost of this retreat was astronomical. German Army Group Center suffered over 500,000 casualties during the winter. Thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of motor vehicles, and nearly 200,000 horses were lost to the cold and the Siberian steel. For a military doctrine built on the preservation of momentum and specialized equipment, this was a catastrophe of the highest order. The political aftermath was equally chaotic. On December 16, 1941, Adolf Hitler issued his famous Haltbefehl, stand-fast order. Furious at the retreat, he forbade any further withdrawals, demanding that his soldiers dig into the frozen ground with their fingernails if necessary. This order arguably saved the German army from a total Napoleonic collapse, but it came at the cost of a massive purge of the military leadership. Hitler dismissed Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, took personal command of the army, and sacked dozens of high-ranking generals, including the legendary Heinz Guderian. The era of the General Staff's war was over. The era of Hitler's personal, fanatical management of the front had begun. For the Soviet Union, the miracle at Moscow provided the first tangible evidence that the state could survive. It wasn't just a victory for the Red Army. The world, which had expected the USSR to break, began to see Moscow not as a victim but as the eventual victor. The Lend-Lease aid from the United States and Britain began to flow more freely. As the Western allies realized that their investment in Soviet resistance was no longer a lost cause, the break had been averted, and in its place was a hardened, vengeful nation that now knew its enemy was mortal. Sergei didn't feel the cold anymore. He only felt the rhythm of his skis. He was a shadow in a world of white. To his left and right, his brothers from the 32nd Siberian Rifle Division moved with the same eerie silence. They had spent 3 weeks on a train from the east, watching the landscape change from the vast taiga to the charred remains of the Russian heartland. There were no sentries. The Germans were huddled in a cellar, trying to steal warmth from a dying fire. Beyond the immediate tactical gains, the failure of Operation Typhoon signaled the permanent death of the blitzkrieg concept in the East. For the first time, the German High Command was forced to confront the reality that their short war was over. The Wehrmacht had gambled everything on a single, decisive blow, and they had lost. This failure necessitated a total restructuring of the German economy and military planning. Germany was now locked into an industrial war of attrition, a contest of raw materials, manpower, and production numbers that it was fundamentally unprepared to win against the combined resources of the USSR, the United States, and the British Empire. In the villages and cities liberated by the advancing Soviet columns, the aftermath revealed the true brutality of the German occupation. The retreating Wehrmacht followed a scorched earth policy, burning bridges, destroying railway lines. These sights further galvanized Soviet resolve. The soldiers who advanced through the ruins of places like Istra and Volokholamsk were no longer the panicked recruits of June. They were veterans who had seen the worst of the new order and had come out the other side. The psychological break that Hitler had predicted had occurred, but it had happened to his own troops, not the defenders of Moscow. Seeing the Red Army's resilience in the face of the Wehrmacht's maximum effort, the Japanese leadership doubled down on their southern strike strategy. This ensured that the Soviet Far Eastern borders remained relatively secure for the duration of the war. It had shifted the entire global chessboard. By the spring of 1942, as the snow began to melt into the mud of the Rasputitsa, the world looked at the Eastern Front and saw a different war entirely. The Soviet Union had stood at the edge of the abyss, looked into it, and stepped back not in retreat, but to gather the strength for a march that would eventually end in the heart of Berlin. The Battle of Moscow was more than a clash of ideologies or a struggle for a railway hub. It was the moment the 20th century's most formidable military machine met the immovable object of human endurance. The world expected the Soviet Union to break because, on paper, it already had. Its air force was decimated, its professional cadres were in prisoner-of-war camps, and its capital was within sight of enemy scouts. Yet history is rarely written on paper alone. The Siberian ghost army that emerged from the blizzards of 1941 became a symbol of a deeper truth in warfare, that technology and tactical brilliance have a freezing point. When the temperature dropped and the machines failed, the war returned to its most primal form, a test of which side could suffer longer and which side belonged to the land. The Siberians didn't just advance. They reclaimed the narrative of the war, proving that the blitzkrieg was not a law of nature, but a fragile system that could be shattered by a well-timed blow from a resilient heart. Today, the fields around Moscow are quiet, the trenches filled by decades of falling leaves and snow. But the legacy of December 1941 remains. It serves as a stark reminder that underestimating an opponent based on their perceived breaking point is the greatest folly a commander can commit. The Soviet Union did not break, because its people decided that the ground beneath them was more than just earth. It was the final line of their existence. They advanced while the world expected them to break, and in doing so, they ensured that the world they left behind would be forever changed.